Revenge in movies is quick and clean, but in real life it's far more disturbing. In this video, we're uncovering 6 of the most horrifying revenge deaths ever recorded, and every one of them proves that some people will wait years, even decades to settle a score. It was August 17, 2013. Apodaca's industrial sprawl stretched across the outskirts of Monterrey, where workers at a small vehicle depot lingered past closing time. Alejandro Alex Flores stood beneath a street lamp, chatting with 2 co-workers about weekend plans. What they didn't know was that Alex's quiet resistance over the past few months had reached its breaking point. Alex was a 32-year-old school bus mechanic. He was known for being organized, punctual, and soft-spoken. He'd worked the same job for 8 years, maintaining the yellow buses that carried children through San Nicolas. His modest house sat on a quiet street where he lived with his wife Maria and their 2 children, ages 6 and 4. Friends described him as a man who kept his head down and took care of his family, exactly the kind of person who should have been left alone. When a local gang began demanding weekly protection fees from neighborhood businesses, Alex made a decision that would cost him everything. He refused to pay, believing that giving in meant permanent entanglement with criminals who would never stop asking for more. Over the following weeks, he filed quiet complaints with police, submitting license plates and descriptions anonymously. There was no formal protection program, just vague promises of follow-up that never materialized. Days went on and the threats escalated. Gang members began mentioning his family by name, asking about his children's school schedule. Alex confided in close friends, but still showed up to work every day, hoping the situation would resolve itself. That evening, as the shop lights dimmed and his co-workers smoked cigarettes on the curb, Alex looked more tense than usual. He'd recently learned from a neighbor that strangers had been asking questions about his kids. At 7:45 in the evening, 2 men approached from the end of the street. According to eyewitness Jose Ruiz, one wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. The other had a bandana masking his features. They walked with purpose but didn't run, closing the distance quickly. When they were within arm's reach, the hooded man said plainly that it was for not paying, and before Alex could react, he drew a short blade from his waistband and lunged. Alex turned to run but managed only 2 steps before the attacker slashed his neck from behind. He stumbled forward and collapsed into the gutter, one hand gripping his throat as blood poured. Jose shouted and rushed forward as the second man delivered a vicious kick to Alex's ribs. Both assailants fled down the narrow alley, disappearing into the maze of industrial buildings. Jose knelt beside his co-worker, desperately trying to compress the wound while another mechanic ran for shop rags and called for help. Within minutes, Alex's breathing became shallow, then stopped entirely. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, but it was far too late. Alex had bled out, the fatal wound a deep slash across the side of his neck. Surveillance footage from a nearby warehouse captured part of the attack, providing investigators with critical evidence. Using Jose's detailed description, police arrested 2 suspects in early September, both low-level gang members under 25. Alex's second cousin arranged a private funeral in Monterrey, attended by family and co-workers who remembered him as a good man who'd simply tried to do the right thing. The local press ran a brief story in the crime section. Mechanic killed over extortion refusal. No larger investigation followed. The garage reopened 2 days later, and life continued as if Alex Flores had never existed. It was April 5, 2014. A gray Saturday evening was settling over South Bristol. Sarah Milton turned the corner toward her front door, her canvas library bag bumping softly against her hip as street lamps flickered on in the dusk. What she didn't realize was that someone had been waiting for this exact moment. Sarah wasn't the type to make enemies. The 45-year-old part-time librarian at Redfield Primary School was known for her calm, careful manner and gentle way with children. She lived alone in a modest terraced house after her divorce 3 years earlier, but remained close to her sister Claire and her 2 young nieces. Friends described her as someone who avoided confrontation and preferred the quiet company of books to the complications of adult drama. A year earlier, Sarah's peaceful world had been shattered when one of her nieces made a troubling comment during a sleepover. The 8-year-old had mentioned something inappropriate about her stepfather, Sarah's brother-in-law, Marcus Webb. Sarah spent sleepless nights wrestling with what to do before finally reporting the incident to social services. She knew the consequences would be devastating, but protecting her niece mattered more than family harmony. The investigation that followed tore the family apart. Marcus was arrested and charged. but the case collapsed at trial due to insufficient evidence. He was acquitted after the defense successfully argued that the child's testimony was unreliable. Marcus publicly claimed his life had been ruined by false accusations, losing his job, and facing community suspicion. Privately, he blamed Sarah for destroying everything he'd built. In the weeks following the trial, Sarah tried to resume her quiet routines. She cataloged books, helped struggling readers, and maintained her professional composure. But neighbors later said she'd grown wary, double-checking locks, pausing when coming home after dark, glancing over her shoulder more frequently. The family rift had left her isolated, cut off from her sister who'd chosen to believe her husband's denials. That Saturday evening, Sarah had stayed late at the school library, organizing new arrivals for Monday's classes. By the time she reached her block, dusk had settled, and a light drizzle had begun. As she approached her porch, she noticed a figure in a gray hoodie lingering near the bus stop. She hesitated, keys in hand, but the man didn't move. Reassuring herself it was nothing, she unlocked her front door. According to eyewitness Emma Hayes, who lived across the street, the figure crossed the road at a jog and reached Sarah's door within seconds. Before Sarah could close it behind her, the man raised a small handgun and fired twice through the narrow opening. The shots echoed through the quiet neighborhood. One bullet struck Sarah's chest, the other her face. She fell backwards through the doorway. Emma watched in horror as the shooter shoved Sarah's body with his foot, sending her tumbling down the short porch steps to land face first on the concrete. Emma screamed and dialed emergency services while her teenage son waited for the man to leave before running across the street with a towel, desperately trying to compress the bleeding. Another neighbor brought a blanket, but Sarah was already beyond help. She never regained consciousness. Police arrived within 7 minutes, but paramedics declared Sarah dead at the scene. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as massive head trauma and a fatal gunshot wound to the chest. Within 48 hours, officers arrested Marcus Webb at a flat in Bedminster, where they recovered clothing matching Emma's description, and a handgun later confirmed to match the ballistic evidence from the scene. Gunshot residue was also found on Webb's hands, though investigators noted its limited evidentiary value compared to the ballistic match. Sarah Milton's funeral was held the following Friday at St. Luke's Church, just blocks from the school where she'd worked. Dozens of children, parents, and former colleagues attended, placing daisies and paper cranes beside her casket. In the days that followed, authorities confirmed that Marcus Webb would face charges for murder and firearm possession. The trial began 6 months later, but for Sarah Milton, justice would come too late. It was September 14th, 2015. The narrow lane behind Howrah Market buzzed with the day's final movements. Amir Ali, a 27-year-old tailor, turned off the bare bulb inside his workshop and stepped into the alley that would claim his life. Amir was just a craftsman with steady hands and a growing clientele who rented a small ground-floor unit, working long hours stitching saris, school uniforms, and cheap men's trousers. Clients described him as polite and serious, always undercharging regulars. His calloused fingers moved with practiced precision across fabric, building a modest life one stitch at a time. But 3 months earlier, everything changed. A street gang with links to a local councillor approached Amir with a proposition that would destroy his quiet existence. They demanded he help funnel campaign funds through bogus tailoring orders, a common scheme in Kolkata's political underworld. Amir refused, unwilling to compromise his integrity for dirty money. The consequences came swiftly. Posters appeared near his shop calling him a traitor to the ward. A local tea stall vendor warned him to stay careful. Friends urged him to relocate, but Amir stayed. He told neighbors he wouldn't be bullied out of the life he'd built with his own hands. That Monday afternoon, Amir worked until just past 5 o'clock. As he pulled the corrugated shutter halfway down, he waved to Sumita Sharma, a widow who lived in the next unit. She smiled and began locking her gate. Neither saw the two men waiting. Sumita heard it first. Raised voices, the scrape of metal against stone. When she stepped outside, she witnessed Amir being dragged into the narrow passage by two men in jeans and sandals. One wore a bandana over his mouth. They pinned Amir against the wall beside his sewing machine. He fought desperately, blocking the first swing of a metal rod, twisting out of their grip, but one attacker slammed the rod across Amir's shoulder, and he staggered. The second plunged a short knife into his chest. Amir fell hard onto concrete, blood spreading around his legs. The taller man struck again, this time to his skull. His body went still. Sumita screamed and ran for help. Two men from a nearby fruit stall rushed in, grabbing one attacker while the other fled. Amir lay motionless beside his broken sewing stool, blood seeping into half-stitched uniforms scattered across the floor. An ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, but Amir had already succumbed to head trauma and blood loss. His body was taken to a government hospital, then released for cremation. Neighbors left garlands and candles at the shuttered shop. Amir's funeral was held the next morning at the local mosque, attended by family, clients, and fellow artisans who quietly walked behind the hearse through the old market lanes. His sewing machine, still stained, was later moved to his parents' home in Baruipur. Within 48 hours, police confirmed the arrest of one suspect and launched a search for the second. Officials also opened a parallel investigation into the counselor's alleged ties to the extortion ring. It was December 2, 2016. The cold had set in early that year across Krakow's Nowa Huta district, and the courtyard between concrete apartment blocks echoed with the crunch of boots on frost. Tomasz Wojcik pulled his white service van into his usual spot, headlights cutting briefly across cracked pavement before everything went dark forever. Tomasz was a 34-year-old licensed electrician who had spent 12 years working residential jobs across Krakow, building a reputation as dependable, soft-spoken, and almost obsessively thorough. Friends described him as private but principled, traits that would ultimately cost him his life. 6 months earlier, those principles had put Tomasz on a collision course with his past. When his old friend Dawid M. drove drunk and killed a pedestrian, Dawid expected the silence that often protects friendships in tight-knit communities. Instead, Tomasz gave the court a full statement, detailing everything he'd witnessed. As Dawid was led away in handcuffs, he shouted across the courtroom that Tomasz would regret this. The threat hung over Tomasz. He avoided the bars and old hangouts, telling his wife Lydia not to worry. They had 2 young sons, and most evenings Tomasz came home directly after work, seeking the safety of routine and family. That Friday evening, Lydia was warming pierogi in the kitchen when she heard the familiar rumble of his van. She glanced at the clock, 6:43 p.m., and called to the boys to wash up. Outside, Tomasz stepped from the driver's side and swung his toolbox down, unaware that death was waiting between 2 parked cars. From his second-floor window, Pavel Nowak, a nearby resident, saw the figure emerge from the shadows, a man in a dark jacket and gloves, holding something metallic. At first, Pavel assumed it was a tool, but moments later he heard a sharp shout that made him realize something was wrong. The attacker ran toward Tomasz with a furious scream, threatening retribution. Tomasz turned and raised his arms in defense, but the first hammer blow shattered his forearm, and the second struck near his temple. He staggered and dropped to one knee. The third blow landed on his skull with a sickening crack, sending him collapsing beside his van's front wheel. Lydia opened the building door just as the hammer was lifted again. Her scream echoed through the courtyard. The attacker hesitated, then bolted toward the alley beside the garages. Pavel and another neighbor rushed out barefoot, chasing the killer through side streets, but he vanished into Nowa Huta's maze of concrete blocks. They stopped searching and called for help. Tomasz lay unconscious, bleeding heavily from skull and mouth. Lydia knelt beside him, trying to cradle his head. He never regained consciousness. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes, but Tomasz was pronounced dead an hour later at the hospital. Authorities opened a homicide investigation within 24 hours, naming Dawid M. as a primary suspect based on motive and prior threats. A citywide warrant was issued, and surveillance footage from nearby garages was collected, but no arrest had been made by the year's end. Tomasz's funeral was held 3 days later at the Rakowicki Cemetery, attended by hundreds of co-workers, neighbors, and former clients. His wife Lydia stood beside the coffin with their 2 sons. It was June 19, 2017. A quiet winter evening was settling over Melbourne's outer suburbs, and the Dandenong Creek Trail had thinned out from its usual bustle of cyclists and commuters. Grace Thompson ran alone along a wooded stretch, her breath visible in the chill air, earbuds in, jacket zipped high, unaware she was running toward her final moments. Grace was a 29-year-old child welfare caseworker at a mid-sized NGO focused on family support services, dedicated to protecting vulnerable children and families. Her colleagues described her as thorough and principled, qualities that had recently put her life in danger. In the months prior, Grace had submitted detailed internal reports exposing financial mismanagement by senior staff, specifically inflated travel reimbursements and grant money diverted to personal expenses. While the board took public steps toward reform, Grace privately told a friend that one board member, Darren O., had become cold and hostile, believing she had made him a target. Grace maintained a strict routine: office by 8 a.m., field visits midday, trail run after work. That Monday, she left the building at 5:12 p.m., still wearing her staff ID clipped to her pocket. The trail entrance was 5 minutes from her apartment, a familiar path she'd run hundreds of times before. At approximately 5:41 p.m., Paul Chen was jogging 60 feet behind Grace when he witnessed something that would haunt him forever. A man in a gray hoodie stepped from the brush. Paul initially thought he might be homeless until he noticed the gun in the man's hand. The man blocked Grace's path and demanded that she hand over her phone. She removed one earbud, confused, as he told her to delete the files. Grace backed away, refusing, and the man raised a small black revolver and shot her once in the abdomen at close range. She collapsed instantly onto the cold asphalt. Paul shouted and sprinted toward them, but the gunman fled into the adjacent woodland. Paul remained with Grace, who was bleeding heavily from the wound. Struggling to speak, she asked him for help as he pressed his jacket against the injury and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes. Grace was rushed to Royal Melbourne Hospital in critical condition, underwent emergency surgery, but died 2 hours later from internal bleeding. Detectives recovered CCTV footage from a nearby park entrance, showing Darren O. lingering in the area shortly before the attack. He was arrested the next morning and charged with premeditated murder. Grace's funeral was held 4 days later at a small church in Ferntree Gully, attended by family, co-workers, and several former clients who credited her with changing their lives. Her parents requested no media presence, and the service remained quiet, personal, and untelevised. In response to her death, Victoria Police launched a review of threats against whistleblowers in non-profit sectors. Officials opened a separate inquiry into the NGO's financial practices and board oversight procedures. It was October 11th, 2018. A cool, bright Thursday settled over the edge of Quebec City, where the shipping yard near the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence River stood quiet under a pale autumn sky. Containers were stacked in neat grids, forklifts parked in rows, radios silent. It was lunchtime. Marc-André Boucher crossed the gravel lot alone, heading toward his pickup truck and walking straight into a deadly confrontation. Marc-André was a 51-year-old forklift operator who had spent 16 years working the industrial port. Known for being even-tempered and hard-working, he rarely missed a shift, kept meticulous logs of cargo movements, and often helped train new hires. Outside of work, he lived a quiet life with his wife in Beauport and took pride in small things, tinkering with old radios, mowing his lawn, and staying out of trouble. 3 months earlier, during a routine inventory audit, Marc-André uncovered discrepancies in load counts and flagged them to HR. A follow-up investigation revealed that foreman Serge Lamontagne had been falsifying outgoing shipment data for years, inflating hours, and moving product without records. Marc-André's detailed statement was instrumental in the inquiry that led to Serge's suspension, though he remained on site in a reduced role. By early October, tension had returned to the yard. Serge avoided eye contact and kept his distance from the man who had exposed his crimes. Marc-André didn't speak much about the situation. That Thursday, at approximately 12:17 p.m., Marc-André paused between rows of containers to check a text from his wife. He held his lunchbox in one hand, phone in the other, completely unaware that death was approaching from the shadows. Lucy Tremblay, a co-worker walking nearby, witnessed what happened next. Serge emerged from between two containers carrying something in his hand. She initially thought it was a tool until she saw him raise it with murderous intent. Serge approached quickly and, without warning, raised a large steel wrench and struck Marc-André across the back of the head with devastating force. The sound of impact was sharp and immediate. Marc-André dropped to one knee, then collapsed sideways onto the gravel. Lucy screamed as Serge stepped forward and struck again, this time to the temple with brutal precision. Lucy rushed in, grabbing Serge's arm, but he shoved her off with a blank expression that she later said chilled her to the bone. Other workers, hearing the commotion, ran from the break room. Serge dropped the bloody wrench and fled between trailers toward the back gate, leaving Marc-André motionless on the ground, with blood pooling beneath his right ear. One of his co-workers phoned for help. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and confirmed death at the scene from massive head trauma. Police located Serge at his apartment in Beauport that afternoon and arrested him without incident. Murder charges were filed the next morning. Marc-André's funeral was held the following Tuesday at Église Saint-Ignace de Loyola, attended by dozens of co-workers, family, and longtime neighbors. His wife, Mireille, delivered a brief eulogy, remembering him as a quiet man who believed in doing what was right, even when it cost him. Officials conducted a full internal review of how Serge Lamontagne had remained employed on site after his suspension. Workplace safety inspectors also launched an investigation into procedural gaps that may have enabled the attack to occur unnoticed. Thanks for watching. If these real-life accounts of betrayal and tragedies entertained you, click here for more.